I want to thank Wendy for that work, which has shaped my own thinking in so many ways, but has also brought critical political theory to the center of a broad public conversation about the world we live in, the world we want, and the world that we can hope for. Throughout her career, Wendy has modeled for me what it means to read and think with others, including those like Max Weber, Carl Schmitt, and Friedrich Nietzsche, those with whom I have profound political disagreements, but from whom I and we have much to learn nonetheless. I want to acknowledge from the start, though I'll come back to it at the end of my talk, that Wendy cracked open the historical canon, the so-called great books of Western political theory, for those of us determined to dig for pearls among the dead white men. She has given us a right to these thinkers, a claim on these books, and good reasons for returning to them. And I want to thank all of you, too, all of the conference participants, for this spirited scholarly exchange in these dreadfully dispiriting times. I'm genuinely grateful for this gathering, for the feeling of fellowship and camaraderie, and for all of the intellectual seriousness and rigor, which now feels like its own kind of protest practice against the dangerously stupid men who control the world. May we find in communities like this the courage to take some slice of power back, not merely in protest, but in the name of democracy itself, which, as Wendy has argued throughout her career, demands intelligence to survive. I've already raised implicitly some of the major themes of my talk today, a talk entitled Nihilism, Manhood, and Politics, Wendy Brown, contra Leo Strauss. Those topics include reading and thinking with those who are political adversaries, the uses and abuses of great books in the search for human values, the meaning and purpose of intellectual life in sustaining democracy. It will strike some of you as an odd coupling, Wendy Brown and Leo Strauss. Born in Prussia, raised in an Orthodox Jewish family, Leo Strauss as a young man was drawn to neo-Kantian philosophy, the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche, political Zionism, Jewish intellectualism, and right-wing politics. He left Germany in 1932, not even a full year before Hitler became chancellor, first fleeing to Paris, then to England, and eventually in 1937 to the United States. For the next decade, Strauss taught at the New School for Social Research in New York City before taking a position at the University of Chicago, where he spent the next 2 decades of his illustrious career. During those 20 years in Chicago, Strauss became one of the most prolific and influential political theorists in the United States, mentoring a generation of scholars trained in his distinctive method of reading historical texts, so-called esoteric reading, or reading for the secret meaning and hidden intentions of an author. Students schooled in Strauss's admiration for the ancients and his rejection of modernity. Strauss's rejection of modernity can be summed up in a single word: nihilism. Nihilism had different starting points: historicism, egalitarianism, progressivism, passivism, and positivism, and even somewhat different itineraries: relativism, reformism, revolution. But all roads led, according to Strauss, to this same destination. Nihilism, for Strauss and his followers, is where modernity, which comes in waves, inevitably hits the shore. It buries and breaks all values, all virtues, all reasoning in the process. Strauss has had a tremendous influence on the American right, most notoriously in the foreign policy adventurism of the George W. Bush administration and its ongoing war on terror, but in my view, more notably on an earlier generation of neoconservative social scientists who crafted a politics of law and order in response to the manifold crises of mass democracy, the crisis in welfare liberalism, the crisis in urban governance, and the crisis in social reproduction that followed the civil rights movement, feminism, and the rise and fall of the New Left. Strauss remains a beacon on the right, even after it has turned away from elements of the neoconservative agenda, though not, importantly, the politics of law and order, right? After it's turned away from elements of the neoconservative agenda to embrace so-called national conservatism, post-liberalism, and Caesarist authoritarianism. Strauss's anti-modernism and his view that nihilism is the true telos of modernity positively flourishes on the right today, especially the online right, which is also where nihilism is most clearly expressed and indulged. I will come back to this contradiction in a moment. That is, the curious embrace of nihilism among those who purport to be its critics, a posture that Strauss himself anticipates. But first I want to say a bit more about Strauss's anti-modernism as it relates to knowledge and politics, with the caveat that for Strauss, these domains, knowledge and politics, are rife with nihilism, but not necessarily distinctive in their relationship to it. Nihilism for Strauss is a civilizational sickness, a sickness of civilization itself, which also means that the term nihilism loses some of its explanatory value and critical purchase. This, I think, is a key difference in Wendy Brown's reflections on nihilism, a condition that she, following Weber more than Nietzsche, treats in its specific causes in and effects upon knowledge and politics. Brown, I would argue, provides an aperture for attending to the particular problems of knowledge and politics in Strauss. In the knowledge domain, the key culprits for Strauss are historicism and positivism, both of which he sees as tending ineluctably toward nihilism. He develops this argument in what is perhaps his best-known book, a book called Natural Right and History, where he takes aim at historicism in both its Burkean and its Heideggerian iterations, and positivism in its Weberian forms. One of the things that's remarkable about Natural Right and History is that it is, in my view, on my reading, a right-wing critique of the intellectual foundations of right-wing politics. His targets, his main oppositions, include Burke's defense of traditionalism, right, virtually synonymous with modern conservatism, or what Michael Oakeshott would later call the conservative disposition, right? Heidegger's notion of historicity, right, implicated in German fascism and blood and soil anti-Semitism, and Weber's pursuit of value-free social science, a liberal conservatism, or conservative liberalism of the status quo. All of these thinkers, and all of these theories tend for Strauss toward nihilism. Burkean tradition, because it cannot distinguish between traditions worth defending and those that are not. Heideggerian historicity, because it ultimately spells the ends or the limits of philosophical knowledge about being itself. Weberian positivism, because it retreats from rational reflection on values, including the values that underwrite the pursuit of knowledge itself. Strauss's appeal to the classical formulation of natural right, nature and right as these were once understood by the ancients, is for him the alternative to historicism and to positivism, as well as to the quintessentially modern formulations of natural right that are bound to historicist ideas of progress and positivist ideas of equality. This is what makes Natural Right in History a right-wing book, in my view. Right? It challenges the prevailing intellectual foundations of right-wing politics and shows how they are feeble in the face of liberal and socialist formulations of natural right. Strauss aims to defend natural right against the radicals and revolutionaries who had usurped it, as well as against the traditionalists who had surrendered it. There's a political polemic in Strauss's critique of historicism and positivism, but both are treated as flawed ways of knowing the world, not necessarily as principles for organizing it. Indeed, the real problem with historicism and positivism, according to Strauss, is that both make it impossible to articulate and defend such principles, thus leaving societies vulnerable to much more dangerous ideas. Indeed, the very ideas that Burke, Heidegger, and Weber would have rightly recognized as dangerous. Nihilism in politics, by contrast with knowledge, is a result of radicalism, according to Strauss. Radical socialism, radical liberalism, and the radical responses to both from anti-liberal and anti-socialist quarters. This is another key difference between Strauss and Brown. For Brown, nihilism unleashes a certain superficiality in politics, a surface politicization of minor differences and lifestyle choices. Everything from where one lives to how one eats becomes a partisan issue, each signaling one's tribal membership more than any deep ideological commitment. Nihilism for Strauss, and here he's much closer to a conventional and colloquial usage, registers a certain immoderation in politics, the fury of uncompromising commitment, a taste for the extremes, and an impulse to destroy. Nihilism is portended everywhere and by everything in Strauss's work, at least whenever he's reflecting on the tendencies of the modern age. But it is often an unspecified threat, rather than something fully fleshed out in its contours and implications. On at least one occasion, however, Strauss did attempt to elaborate on this term. In a lecture he delivered at the New School for Social Research in February 1941, just 2 months after the United States had officially entered the war, but before it was officially recognized by the Reich as one of its enemies. Strauss's lecture on the topic of German nihilism considers the generation of young men who, upon returning home after the First World War, became radicalized in their rejection of modern civilization, and more importantly, in their principled anti-communism. The lecture on German nihilism remained unpublished during Strauss's lifetime, but it was delivered in the same year that he published one of his most celebrated essays on persecution and the art of writing. What is especially striking about the lecture is the ambiguity in its account, Strauss's discernible sympathy for the young men who had embraced nihilism, then National Socialism, and eventually Hitler himself. Strauss is mostly dismissive of Hitler, right? That foolish believer in his own racial ideology. And here I'm quoting Strauss, "The less that is said about him, the better." But he also describes Hitler as, quote, "a rather contemptible tool of history, the midwife who assists at the birth of a new epoch, of a new spirit, end quote. The midwife here is not Hitler himself, but history. The suggestion from Strauss is that German nihilism will survive the defeat of Hitler and the demise of National Socialism. And I'm quoting again, "It must be understood from the outset that National Socialism is only the most famous form of German nihilism. Its lowest, most provincial, most unenlightened, and most dishonorable form," end quote. The implication, of course, is that there is a form of German nihilism that is lofty, worldly, enlightened, and honorable. Strauss's lecture can be understood, I would argue, as a vindication of this less famous, less infamous form of nihilism, the proper precursor to National Socialism, to which many young German men were attracted. Here's Strauss again, and I think it's the last actual full quote. Quote, "The prospect of a pacified planet, without rulers and ruled, of a planetary society devoted to production and consumption only, to the production and consumption of spiritual as well as material merchandise, was positively horrifying to quite a few very intelligent and very decent, if very young, Germans," end quote. These allegedly very intelligent and very decent young Germans were, for Strauss, rightly horrified by the promise of a planetary society, a society without borders or boundaries, a so-called open society, a society of perpetual peace. They opposed not just Bolshevism or communism, but the ideals of modern civilization itself, from the French Revolution to English utilitarianism. What they perceived in modern civilization was a machinery of manic production and limitless consumption, and with it, the degradation of spiritual values and moral virtues beyond self-preservation and self-interest. Thus, Strauss conceives of German nihilism not simply as a belief in nothing or as a will to nothingness, but as the radical negation of something, of modernity and its hollow hopes. These young men lacked for an affirmative vision of the future, for which Hitler could appear to fill some void. But the fault for this misapprehension lies not, says Strauss, with these very intelligent and very decent young men. It is, says Strauss, the fault of their teachers. Those who could have provided these young men, these men returning from defeat in war, with spiritual values and moral virtues beyond the pieties of modern civilization. He has in mind not the teachers like Heidegger, Junger, and Schmidt, those who were swimming in the same waters of German nihilism, but rather those liberal instructors, like Strauss's own teacher, Ernst Cassirer, who might have furnished models for reconciling old and new, ancient and modern, philosophy and politics. German nihilists, says Strauss, were not responsible for National Socialism, or even for Hitler. Liberals were. Getting back to Wendy Brown's reflection on the nihilism of our age and its relationship to neoliberalism and to the rise of the far right, I want to highlight some aspects of Strauss's account of German nihilism, the species of nihilism that flourished in the interwar period, that might be usefully brought to bear on the present moment. First, for Strauss, German nihilism was a legacy of German militarism. Germany's military defeat in the First World War was a sobering experience for these young men, but they had also experienced the intoxicating thrill of risking death on the battlefield and the convictions of their own courage, the belief that they were acting beyond narrow self-interest, beyond even collective utility, on behalf of the highest human values. This is Strauss's gloss, of course, his redemptive portrait of the post-war generation of so-called conservative revolutionaries. But the point I want to emphasize is the link between nihilism and militarism, between nihilism and imperialism, between nihilism and the conduct of war. Nihilism in our age, I think, is shadowed by ongoing and interminable war. The war on terror, not the mass mobilization of a whole population, but a growing chasm between military and civilian life, mediated by video gaming technology that encourages LARPing among soldiers and civilians alike. Now, to be sure, there was a fair bit of LARPing in post-war Germany, among the infamous paramilitary forces as well as the right-wing intellectuals like Heidegger, Junger, and Schmidt, who believed themselves on the front lines of a world historical battle for the soul of the nation and humanity. What I think we have today, by contrast, is a fantasy of struggle, an illusion of sacrifice, felt by those at a comfortable distance from the scene of conflict, those for whom war is a simulated adventure, bearing minimal personal costs or casualties. The thirst for annihilation, as Eva described it yesterday, among those who have been spared its horrors, for those whom it can be a game, a deadly serious game, but a game nonetheless. Strauss also believed that German militarism was the legacy of German philosophy, and it's a very German story. For Strauss, we're going to have to go before the Russians, going to have to dig all the way back, right? That the story begins really in Germany, gets kind of taken up by the Russian nihilists, and then comes back home to Germany to assume its political form. But for Strauss, there is something in nihilism that bears the legacy of German philosophy. The national imperialist philosophies of the 18th century German idealists, the naturalist and supernaturalist philosophies of the 19th century German romantics, and perhaps most importantly, the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, whose influence on Strauss's own thought, including his critique of nihilism, cannot be overstated. For Strauss, last quote. This one's a good one, though. For Strauss, quote, the relation of Nietzsche to the German Nazi revolution is comparable to the relation of Rousseau to the French Revolution. That is, he is no more, but also no less to blame for Hitler than Rousseau is responsible for Robespierre. But it is the radicalism of German philosophy, epitomized by Nietzsche, that accounts for the spirit of German militarism. And more than militarism, it is philosophy itself, German philosophy, the philosophy of radical negation, that gave us nihilism. Not an absolute negation, not an absolute negativity, but the determinate negation of modern civilization. Nihilism was a German philosophical problem that demanded a political and philosophical solution. Unlike the English, and now I'm coming to everybody's home turf, unlike the English, who Strauss credits with a kind of temperamental moderation that makes for very good citizens, but middling philosophy, the Germans have great philosophers, but poor civic sensibilities. They have no tradition of liberal democracy, no positive theory of citizenship, no concept of civil society that is not subservient to an imperial state. Simply put, the radicalism that makes German philosophy world historical in its significance is also what makes German politics low, provincial, unenlightened, and dishonorable. Thus, the Germans, Strauss concedes, do not deserve the empire that they seek. Their nihilism is undisciplined by law and politics, which leaves them susceptible to a foolish charlatan like Hitler. What these young Germans needed, said Strauss, in addition to good teachers, was a leader like Winston Churchill. Surprise! In Churchill, Strauss saw not the guardian of modern civilization, much less the defender of English values, but a model for men who were willing to fight and die for something greater than themselves. Churchill was the example of real courage, of extraordinary political wisdom, of a sober manliness worthy of imitation. Paradoxically, it was Churchill, the man who knew defeat but could not be defeated by Hitler, who epitomized the real virtues of German nihilism. Okay, so we would seem to be on a terrain quite different from Wendy Brown's. But there are, I think, some striking parallels. Both Strauss and Brown are close readers of Nietzsche, one from the right, the other from the left, and their work is shaped in significant ways by Nietzsche's critique of modernity. Both are profound admirers of Weber, though both opposed Weberian positivism and the fact-value distinction in the social sciences. Brown, too, theorizes the degrading effects of nihilism on higher education, and in turn, the impact of a degraded education on an increasingly nihilistic culture. Indeed, Brown's thinking in this area of education and higher education, suggests the extent to which Strauss himself was the creature of the conditions he diagnosed. For he too wanted professors to act as prophets and priests, offering students answers, as opposed to asking them questions, which we might have thought was the true practice of philosophy in the Socratic tradition. Finally, and these are the points with which I will conclude, Brown too sees nihilism as intimately bound to a politics of manhood and inevitably entwined with a politics of charisma. Let me just say a few words very briefly, about both manhood and charisma before turning things over to Wendy, Eva, and all of you. What does nihilism have to do with manhood, with the politics of manhood? For Strauss, German nihilism was a young men's movement. The young men bitterly defeated in war, who defined themselves by their manly courage, their willingness to sacrifice themselves without any personal benefit. To fight and die for one's country, these young men and Strauss believed, was beyond all utilitarian calculation, all considerations of self-interest. For this reason, courage was man's highest virtue, the meaning of manhood in its best sense. But these German nihilists fused that warrior courage with a youthful spiritedness and rebellion. They embodied another kind of manhood, defiant, audacious, ungovernable. The model of manhood that these young Germans learned from street fighting more than reading Nietzsche. Strauss believed these young men needed discipline, but that civilization needed the virility and intensity that the German nihilists embodied. Again, nihilism for Strauss was not about nothingness or the absence of meaning. It was about the fullness of passion. It was about a passionate contempt for the cool comforts of bourgeois liberalism. Nihilism is Strauss's absolutely favorite word. Usually the sign of decadence and destruction, but occasionally idealized as a wayward protest against the effeminacies of civilization. Strauss's attitude toward the German nihilists is echoed today across the manosphere, which has become basically coterminous with the internet itself, and all over the masculinist right. Brown has a different account of the politics of manhood in our Nihilistic Times, not a spirited and youthful vitality, but a wounded and aging male supremacism, which has nonetheless managed to mobilize millions of young men online. In the final chapter of In the Ruins, Brown cites the incel movement as one of the more extreme iterations of the nihilistic form of freedom. Here I'm quoting Brown. "I will because I can, because I believe in nothing and I am nothing other than my will to power." This nihilism, this de-sublimated will to power, Brown argues, also appeals to traditional values and indeed unleashes the will to power in those traditional values. The incel movement, she argues, quote, draws on a nihilistic version of moral traditionalism before feminism, in which men's or male sexual access to women was a matter of right, end quote. And of course, many of those who participate in this movement believe their right to sex can, should, must be retaken by force. Incels may be an extreme example, but there is a bit of incel energy in every nook and cranny of the internet, in every act of trolling and online aggression. And this energy is one of the dominant forces in our politics today, this aggrieved masculinity, this waning white male supremacy, which is wounded but not destroyed, thus bent on revenge or worse. Brown describes an apocalyptic impulse among those losing their status or place in the world, and I quote, "If white men cannot own democracy, there will be no democracy. If white men cannot rule the planet, there will be no planet," end quote. This is a white male supremacy that would rather end the world than share it with others. Ressentiment is a key part of the account of nihilism we get from Strauss and from Brown, but it is cast differently. For Strauss, ressentiment was directed against the weak, those who took cover behind their liberal pieties. Nihilistic manhood was a revolt against the weakness of Western civilization. By contrast, for Brown, ressentiment targets the powerless, not the weak. Nihilistic manhood is a desperate terrorism, the terror of white male supremacism at its most vulnerable and insecure. We might ask, and I hope we can discuss, where do women fit into this story? This apocalypse story of waning white male supremacy? What is womanly nihilism? What does it look like? Might we see it in the trad wife who monetizes traditional values as her own personal brand? Might we recognize it in the forms of female anti-feminism that solicit male power and masculinist protection? Is it nihilism that helps to explain why radical feminism has been hijacked by the anti-trans movement? Can nihilism help us to understand why the most potent form of radical feminism today is trans exclusionary? I don't have answers for these questions, but I would suggest that the politics of manhood has always been connected to the cult of true womanhood. Finally, charisma. In her recent book on Weber, Brown offers the provocative suggestion that nihilism be worked through politically, not overcome culturally or resolved philosophically. Again, another critical difference from Strauss, who treated philosophy even more than politics, Churchill aside, philosophy as the answer to nihilism. Brown argues that no, politics is precisely where we struggle over meaning and values, where we make meaning and try to impose our values on the world. Brown suggests that charisma is an inescapable part of political life, one that the left has tended to treat with some justifiable suspicion, but which is probably also essential for any viable left movement. A viable left movement to win, to actually seize the power necessary to transform the world. I think Brown is probably right that the left needs to embrace some form of charisma, even if it's undeniably true that left charisma would be something very different in style and substance from what we see on the right. But I also think it's important to historicize the reemergence of charismatic politics and the form it takes in our media-saturated culture. Brown's own work on neoliberalism is, in my view, precisely the place to begin that work. Charisma assumes a particular importance, I would argue, in an increasingly unregulated economy of immateriality and influence. That is, when there are no actual commodities of value being circulated, only clicks and likes and hacks and scams, charisma becomes the most valuable currency. When economies are largely deregulated and unregulated either by traditional values or by rational interests, charismatic authority assumes an outsized importance. Charisma has always been a part of politics. As Victoria argued yesterday, it is a legacy of the theological dimension of politics, especially as it is ordered and organized by the modern state. But charisma now dominates all aspects of our culture, transformed by neoliberalism and the attention economy of the internet. It appears we have all become believers in magic. And perhaps what is needed today is not a God who will save us, but a magician who can break the spell. A counter-charismatic whose highest calling is to restore to us a sense of our own tremendous power and our profound responsibility to the world and to others. Thank you.
So try to do this without crying, and I'm going to explain why I might. What Joe identified was Deba and Robyn's camaraderie at the Institute for Advanced Study, where I work, 3 years ago, and Robyn identified me as important in her life. Robyn was a student of mine decades ago. Decades ago. And I'm delighted to be learning from her now. That's what happens when, yes, you're nodding, when you listen to certain of your students. I was a student of Sheldon Wollin's. Leo Strauss was untouchable, unspeakable. Apparently, like many things in life, you can skip a generation and begin talking. Leo Strauss was untouchable and unreadable because he was a political enemy of left political theory, but also, I think, because he was a rival, a profound rival. Sheldon Wolin embodied a certain kind of very offbeat left political and critical theory, not conventional Marxism, not even conventional Arendtian sort of leftism. Another discussion, argument for another day. But a very distinctive kind, Strauss as well. I always suspected their deep closeness, proximity. In their ways of reading, this will only be interesting to people who know both Wolin and Strauss, and I'll move on to nihilism in a second. In Wolin and Strauss's ways of reading, which Strauss dared name esoteric, and Wolin just called close and careful. But there was always a secret, there was always something buried, there was always a motivation, there was always often a psychic dimension that Wolin would surface. In their critiques, they both had a severe critique of modernity and liberalism. In their aspirations for worlds beyond the ones that they found themselves inhabiting, and above all, in the vocation of theory, both really, really believed that political theory, as scholarly as it must be, also had to be had to be about the world, and had to be some kind of intervention in the world. Not necessarily by actually touching power, but by opening up what our world was and reading it differently than common sense read it. So in listening to Robyn on Strauss and me, I was able to bottle my tears and displace the embarrassment by thinking about Wolin and Strauss, and also thinking about something else I gained from my teacher, which was a commitment to a critical relationship to the left to make a better left, which Robyn has just described, and I never thought about it before, as Strauss's relationship to the right. So there's another way in which these legacies, if that's what they are now, are very convergent. What I learned from Robyn today, because she opened texts that have been forbidden to me for a very long time, was that Strauss is actually a profound thinker of nihilism, and that were I to read him, I would be able to put together something I've never been able to put together, which is the nihilism and the anti-nihilism, not in sequence, as I've always suggested they need to unfold, because I'm too wedded to Nietzsche. We're in nihilism, we need a bridge out. But the way that nihilism and anti-nihilism coexist right now. And for Robyn to teach us that Strauss was staring at these kids, nihilistic kids, immensely disappointed by the conditions of life, and then utterly mobilizable by Hitler. A form of anti-nihilism that obviously Strauss didn't endorse, but that he recognized as anti-nihilism, even if it still had a nihilistic drive within it, seems to me an important way for us to be able to think about our contemporary conditions, and that's exactly what Robyn did. I want to say a little bit about the wars that Robyn described as important, or militarism that Robyn described as important in shaping and I think accelerating the nihilism of our time in the Euro-Atlantic world. And I want to say a little bit especially about what happened, I think, in the US that goes beyond thinking about the war on terror as an eternal war or the problem of war as a game or a fantasy. It seems to me that what Robyn has opened up, and I would like us to maybe think further about, although it is very much a US predicament, is the extent to which the last three major wars in the United States, the Vietnam War, the Afghan War, the Iraq War, were not just failures, but redounded back to the families that in the US that suffered lost or maimed children participating in those wars, redounded back to them as pointless, utterly pointless. There is no one you could find on the street in the US at this point who would defend the US intervention in Afghanistan or Iraq. Right to left, they are understood as not morally wrong. The US never comes to that position. But a waste, pointless, stupid. And it's not even about the falsified documentation that Bush developed in order to be able to justify those wars. They're just understood as wars that did nothing except maybe make the world worse and kill a lot of Americans. I'm putting this from a middle to right-wing point of view. And of course, the left opposed them all along. The so-called Vietnam syndrome, the idea the right had in the period between the end of the Vietnam War and the Cold War coming to some kind of end, has faded. That Vietnam syndrome, the idea there was we need to get over our belief that Vietnam was a disastrous war or a failed war or a lost war and discover our bellicosity again. And that, of course, was part of the neoconservative view of how to mobilize American power again for one last imperial gasp in the world. But that's over as well. And so it seems to me that Robyn's emphasis, which I agree with, on the role of militarism in producing nihilism needs to take account as well of the fact that really, I didn't even put Korea in there, but really since World War II, American imperial might and militarism has blown back in its face as absurd, as ridiculous, as life-wasting, and worse, as maiming the psyches and the bodies of hundreds of thousands of American men. And that, it seems to me, is a really important element in the US context at least for developing the basis of what you are putting together, I think, as a story about the manosphere. Last point I want to make has to do with charisma. Yesterday, Victoria, as Robyn mentioned, offered a really smart critique of charisma on the left. I want to join Robyn in rescuing charisma on the left from that critique, in part for reasons that we discussed a bit, which is the idea yesterday, which is the idea that the genesis of the thing, or as Nietzsche puts it, the origin of the thing and what it's eventually deployed for, can be worlds apart. If we take seriously that charisma has a magical element, has a mythological element, but above all, in Weber's understanding, carries the possibility of opening a future other than the one that we take to be the givenness of the present, the solidity of the present, the walled character of the present, the impossibility of leaving the present. If charisma carries that element, and that is so importantly why it builds followers, I don't think we can do without it.
So let's go to questions, I think, and then if you have responses to the points that Wendy's made, we can feed them. All right, so I can see several questions. Let's take a few at a time. Ava, I think you were first.
Oh, but I don't have to vote for it.
And I just have a very small point on the exact comparison of Strauss and Brown, and of course I only know Brown, but from learning so beautifully from you about Strauss, I understood him to draw the connection between militarism and nihilism as there being a war where you have values and higher principles and sacrifice, and then that vanishing and then sort of falling into this abyss. I mean, that's there everywhere, and German culture and art. Now, Wendy's connection in Manhood and Politics, I think, runs a bit different. There it is, there's manhood, and it cuts off the body, life, what sustains life, what's out, the oikos, the countryside around the city, as non-political, in order to have a kind of contrast against which you can kind of inflate masculinity as a certain type of politics. And that's a militaristic politics, because you have to get paranoid or feel like that, and the aggression proof and death risking proves it this. But then in Wendy's telling, I think the militarism itself is nice. And so that, yeah, you're nodding. So anyway, so then we agree. That's what I wanted to tease out with regard to your comparison. And now that motive, I think, Weber, might be, I mean, you said you struggled a bit with the Nihilistic Times book. To me, this motive of like overcoming this splitting off of the sort of non-heroic seems to map in some way on Tagore's project with the cooperative university, but for me, of course, the stress totally fell on this rural setting that has to do with the questions of the villagers and the farm. I mean, oh my God. So, but there seems to me to be an analogy in that and a kind of non-masculinist politics, indeed, that non-masculinist education. And to push that one step further, I mean, I usually hate that kind of too primitive intersectional critique, so forgive me, but it didn't seem like Tagore or Ambedkar talked much about the education of women. Maybe they did. And so maybe if we think this for the 21st century, there could be some drawing, like as you said, the Brahmin caste needs to be annihilated, and now Wendy had some worries about that. But I mean, in Manhood and Politics, it's clear that manhood of that type needs to be, well, I'll say abolished or annihilated for there to be a different kind of politics that can organize itself. And so that might be the analogy to how a different type of knowledge could organize itself, and that's what makes sense.
Thanks, Ava. Let's take a couple more questions. Emily.
Hello, yeah, thank you for all the things. So I'm not familiar kind of beyond headlines with like the work of Weber or Strauss, so this is coming more from a feminist and queer theory perspective. But I was wondering if in either of those thinkers' work or in your own kind of engagements and thinking of them, if there's any link between kind of charisma and erotic surrender, and if that might sort of have anything to do with how we kind of understand masculinity today, but also kind of like always.
Thanks, Emily. I'm going for people who haven't asked questions in sessions I've been in before, so excuse me for now, please.
Thank you. And thank you, Deva, for your presentation, and I'm hearing you speak after about 2 decades, so it's really special. Thank you. So my question is really about the quote that you used from Tagore's letter to his son, which is somewhere beyond the limits of nation and geography. And Shantiniketan Vishwabharati is built on tribal land. And you talked about caste and Ambedkar's, the whole point about nihilism and the assertion of the non-people, which doesn't really take account, it hasn't really taken into account the tribe, the Adivasi, the indigenous. And I feel that the way we are looking at nihilism here is very anthropocentric. So where do we situate the tribe there, on whose land the university is built, whose knowledge has been brought into the university curriculum, imitated, replicated, and yet they are the non-people.
Right. Thank you. I think that's plenty for you to think about now. We'll take some more questions in a minute.
Great. Well, thank you for these questions. Eva, I think you and I are in agreement with some caveat. First, that we both love manhood and politics. We can't quit it.
They're talking about the text.
The text,
Not
not the phenomenon, but the book. I can't quit that book. I return to it as a model in so many ways. So we share that. And I think I mostly agree with you that the argument that Wendy develops in that book has to do with a reading of a kind of masculinist militarism as nihilistic, although that's not her vocabulary back then, right? Occasionally, but it's not a sort of fully worked out sort of account of nihilism. And I also agree with you that militarism involves, as you put it, a kind of splitting off of the oikos and the body and life in order to kind of inflate or augment this domain of manhood partially. I think there is also in the account an elaboration on a kind of counter-sociality that opens up in this practice of manhood. It's why I think it is so sort of challenging. It's why I think that book functions as a kind of as a kind of immanent critique, because there is something on my reading that is made possible in dreadfully possible, terribly possible, and yet possible in a certain practice of manhood and politics. So it's not just a hiving up, it's not just a splitting off, it's not just a quarantining, but rather a kind of counter-sociality built on domination, built on exclusion, and yet I think therefore posing some sort of challenges for political thinking, which it's not so easy to just say no to it. It's not just a kind of no-saying exercise. I think it's one of the things that's amazing about that book and allows it to read so differently from feminist texts of that era. First, because it's not focused on women, right? The feminist reading is not a reading for where are the women, but also it's modeling a kind of critique of manhood in politics that's not simply a no-saying. So it's, I think in this way, kind of counter-nihilistic. This question of erotics is fantastic. I don't know if I have quite the capacity to think it in relationship to charisma quite yet, but I will say that it's all over Strauss. It is absolutely all over Strauss. I would say that it's all over Strauss's thinking about the relationship between teacher and student, which is highly influenced by his own kind of Nietzschean-infused portrait of Socrates and the Socratic endeavor. I would say that erotic life is also kind of buried in his notion of esoteric reading itself, which is reading for secrets. And what is, of course, the most alluring secret of all, but the secret of sex. So I would say that erotics are everywhere in Strauss, as he's also trying to sublimate, suppress, reroute as philosophy, as philosophical practice. Now, erotics in public life, in political life, I think he's, and here I'm just speaking about Strauss, even sort of more uncomfortable with. And so, you know, a certain kind of erotic excess can manifest in philosophy, in the confines of the classroom. It must be disciplined, you know, by moderate teachers, sober teachers, right? I think in politics, he's quite worried about this, and you could say that kind of anti-erotics is precisely why he's drawn to a figure like Churchill. My apologies. Why he's drawn to a figure like Churchill over the kind of foolish charlatanism of Hitler, where I think he recognizes that these young men were sort of seduced in all the wrong ways by a kind of more erotic kind of charisma. But that's all I'll have to say there. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Eva, Emily, and Priyanka for your questions. I'll just quickly try and take Eva's and Priyanka's questions together because it relates to the forms of gendered and slave labor, and I think this is indeed a question that Tagore is grappling with, right, in 1918, and particularly through the establishment of these two organizations, or these two cooperative institutions, one of which is called the Shiksha Satra and the other one is called Lok Shiksha Sansad, right? So through the night schools, the adult night schools, and the mass education programs, which are basically distance mass education programs, he's actually trying to account for, let's say, women's education and also relating to tribal life worlds and tribal slave labor, savoir-faire, right? So by accounting for that kind of the historical kind of interplay of factors, right? So that necessarily goes on to found the fact of the university. So I think there is a certain kind of historical accounting of gender and tribality, right? So, or kind of feudal systems of caste slavery, caste-based enslavement, right? So that is happening there, and Tagore directly addresses the question of Namashudra and Muslim labor, right? So therefore, I think, it's, and it has to be historically grounded, so probably we can have more of those conversations, that Tagore is indeed opening specific concerted programs for women's education, right, at that time. So he's taking on the question of gender in a way that people hadn't till then, right? So, and of course there are other historical parallels there. If I could just quickly also address Emily's question about erotics and charisma, and I think, Robyn has wonderfully already kind of responded to it. I think, yes, of course, right, so the kind of charisma that Weber is talking of, right, so and the erotics of it is kind of imbricated in a certain assumption of masculinity, except for that, for Weber, charisma is not messianic, right? So it is not about a kind of saviorism, right? And that is how he distinguishes the ethic of responsibility from the ethic of conviction. And and this is why I think it's important, and this is what I've also learned in reading Weber through and with Wendy, right? So that what is important is that democracy requires a certain imaginative capacity for time thinking, right? And what is provided by liberal democracy is a certain kind of electoral temporality, right? So you have a 4 or 5 year cycle through which you think time. But when you have to think historical injustice, you have to attune your mind to millennial injustice. Now, how does one, and that is where liberal democracy fails, it fails to kind of institute any imaginative rubric for time thinking beyond electorality or beyond electoral time, right? So, and which is why Weber is constantly kind of posing the question of what is that force of institutionality, right? So even within and outside of plebiscitary democracy, that can help us think time I mean, that is my kind of extrapolation from Weber, right? So and now, if we have to kind of come up with an alternative democracy that is, as Wendy would call, reparative, then we have to try and think time millennially, and which liberal democracy cannot do, right? So which therefore then gives the entire battlefield over to the right, right? So who will trade in theories of ultimate origins and distant horizons, as Jane Geyer would call it, right? So, and for them, it is immemorial time versus millennial time, while there's an entire chasm of difference that actually separates, right? So the right-wing mobilization of immemorial time versus, let's say, a different kind of reparative mobilization of millennial time. Yeah, yeah.
I think, as always, we could go on and on, but we're going to have to draw things to a close, I'm afraid. We'll take 10 minutes, and if people can get coffees and head on to the next session so we can try and start roughly on time, that would be appreciated. But I'm sure you'll all join me in thanking our panelists.